Good morning. So nice to see everyone. We miss you all. Please know that our mission to teach the lessons of the Holocaust will not stop. We'll be communicating virtually with all of you, our volunteers, educators, and partners. Anne Frank would be 91 years old on June 12th. In honor of her birthday, I want to talk about the importance of Anne's diary and the Frank family's thwarted efforts to immigrate. Anne Frank's diary is the most iconic and the most famous. It serves as an entry into the much broader story of the Holocaust. Anne received her diary for her 13th birthday. Her parents let her pick it out in the bookstore. Anne wrote that she hoped she'd be able to entrust everything to her diary and that it would be of great support to her. Anne wrote in Dutch, sometimes in German, and English. Anne's words have inspired thousands of generations of students all over the world. She successfully documented both her emotions and the realities of life in the secret annex from 1942 to 1944. The diary showcases her incredible storytelling ability in such horrific circumstances. It is written in real time. Anne could not know what would happen to her and her family. What motivated Anne to continue writing the diary? Anne heard on the radio that the Dutch government planned to collect diaries after the war. They wanted to document how ordinary people experienced life in the Netherlands under Nazi occupation. At first glance, diaries may seem mundane and unimportant, but diaries are honest and they bring us closer to ordinary people. Diaries are also very important to historians, not just for recording prominent events in history, but for chronicling the life experiences of people in that time. And that is why a diary is considered a primary historical source. Readers experience the events of the Holocaust through the lens of Anne. Anne began to write her diary, calling the new version Het Achterhuis. Anne changed the names of the occupants and added new entries and edited the old ones. She wanted to underplay her relationship with her mother and emerging feelings towards Peter. In the rewritten version, Anne was kinder and some passages were omitted altogether. The authenticity of Anne's diary has been challenged by Holocaust deniers. Among the most virulent deniers, David Irving wrote in one of his books on Hitler that the diary was a forgery. He disputed how a 15-year-old could write so maturely. Other Holocaust deniers called the diary a propaganda legend, one more fraud in the series of frauds perpetrated to tell what they determined was a false story of the Holocaust and the saga of 6 million. The Netherlands State Institute for War Documentation received all of Anne's original diary papers. Forensic and literary analysis was completed with state-of-the-art technology. The state concluded that the diary pages were in Anne's handwriting and that the ink and paper were consistent within that time frame. Further handwriting comparisons and additional research definitively proved that Anne was the author. The diary details a personal and intimate style of writing. When Otto returned from Auschwitz, Miep gave him all the notebooks and papers she had saved. Otto noticed that the Anne's writings included embarrassing family details, so he edited them to save the family's reputation. Later, the edited entries were restored to the original form, exactly as Anne had written them. Anne was developing into a literary writer. During her 25 months in the secret annex, Anne matured, and her writings reflected the changes she observed. As readers, we grasp her strength, resilience, and insight into this unique historical time. And Otto's original plan was to leave Germany. While living in the Netherlands, even before the family went into hiding in 1942, Otto repeatedly tried to immigrate to the United States. I want to describe the insurmountable challenges faced by Otto. The family's immigration efforts were thwarted by restrictive U.S. policies, and their stories is emblematic of thousands of other Jews attempting to flee from Nazi-occupied countries. As you see in the cartoon, anti-immigrant and nativist sentiment grew in the United States after World War I. Even Otto's high-level connections with American businessmen were not enough to secure safe passage. The Franks were met with administrative and logistical obstacles. I want to talk about some of the bureaucratic hurdles they faced. During the 1920s, the U.S. Congress passed laws that severely limited the number of immigrants who could enter the country annually. Restrictive legislation resulted in the 1924 Johnson-Reed Act, which set quotas on the number of immigrants from particular countries that could be admitted each year, particularly from Eastern and Southern Europe. Let's take a look at what was happening in 1938. So as we see in the short video, during the 1930s, anti-immigrant sentiment, intense xenophobia, and anti-Semitism remained pervasive. These strong attitudes influenced the political, economic, and social environment. It influenced how Americans responded to the refugee crisis created by the Nazis. The American press criticized the 32 nations, including the United States, for attending the Evian conference in Les Bains, France, for their inaction. Although most participants expressed sympathy for the refugees, they rejected increased immigration that might further hurt their national economies. Others frankly admitted not wanting Jews. The Dominican Republic was the only country that accepted Jewish refugees. During the 1930s, there was no refugee policy on humanitarian grounds, only a strict immigration policy. In February 1939, Democratic Senator Robert Wagner and Republican Congresswoman Edith Rogers of Massachusetts sponsored identical bills in the U.S. Senate and House of Representatives. Their purpose was to admit 20,000 German refugee children under the age of 14 over a 2-year period. The intent was that these children would not be counted against the existing immigration quota laws. The reality was that most of the German refugee children would be mostly Jewish children. These children would be supported with private donations. Agencies supported the bill that claimed that the children wouldn't add to the nation's existing unemployment. Eleanor Roosevelt supported the bill. The First Lady referred to the bill as a wise way to do a humanitarian act. Even before the bill was introduced, a public opinion poll asked Americans whether they would favor a proposal to permit 10,000 refugee children from Germany to be brought into America. Only 26% of respondents favored the idea, while 67% opposed it. FDR took no position on the bill, mindful of polls showing most Americans were opposed to more immigration. This was the social climate of the times. News about the ship's St. Louis led to further anti-immigration sentiment. Despite much debate in both the House and Senate committees about changing the parameters of the bill, Senator Wagner withdrew the bill, and the Wagner-Rogers bill never came to a vote. Anne Frank might have been one of those 20,000 children. There was limited willingness to accept Jewish refugees. Ironically, a year later, when British children were endangered by German bombing raids, President Roosevelt and Congress agreed to rush through legislation enabling thousands of those children to receive temporary haven in the United States. The first time Otto applied for a U.S. immigration visa was in 1938, the year that Germany annexed Austria. The annual U.S. quota for German immigrants was, as we see, approximately 27,370. And the waiting list continued to grow as Germany began to expand its territorial holdings in Europe. And the waiting lists also skyrocketed. Applicants could expect a wait of 2 years. You can see here in this slide the number of applicants waiting, 45,685, far above the quota. The application process was tedious and expensive. The German and Austrian authorities considered Jews as an enemy of the state with no legal status. This made the process even more difficult and the waiting list more dangerous. Let's take a look at the numerous required documents for immigration. So we see a visa application, a tax document, police certificate, birth certificate, medical clearance, and military discharge papers. So while on a waiting list, you could gather all the documents you need in order to be ready when your turn came up. You also had to go to many government offices and pay hefty fees to obtain the documents. Some had expiration dates, and then you might have to renew them more than once. We see additional requirements: letters of recommendation, bank statements, tax returns, and affidavits from relatives or friends in the United States, testimonies on their character, and again, of course, a hefty fee. You also had to find an American financial sponsor, preferably a relative, since Nazi Germany only allowed Jews to immigrate with a small amount of money. The person had to collect and send documents promising to take responsibility for you after you arrived in the United States. You would have to communicate with them by sending letters, which again could take 2 weeks and weeks to arrive. After September 1940, you needed 2 sponsors, again making the process more difficult. And also know that this is still during the Depression and money was very scarce. You also needed to prove that you had booked passage out of Europe. Travel became very difficult after the war began in September 1939. Ports were closed down and German submarines attacked ships in the Atlantic Ocean. Tickets were expensive, costing the modern day equivalent of thousands of dollars. On top of all these requirements, transit visas were required for each of the countries one would be passing through. You had to obtain stamps in your passport from the countries you would need to travel through to get to the ship's port of departure. These stamps needed to be collected in a specific order, and each cost money. One mistake could send you back to the same government office many times. Many documents and transit stamps also had expiration dates, so these errors could cause additional delay and additional expense. One of the last steps in the process was an interview with the American consulate. When your turn came up from the waiting list, you'd be called to the U.S. consulate for an interview. The State Department official would carefully read all your paperwork to make sure you were financially stable, healthy, and would not be a threat to U.S. national security. State Department officials often rejected applicants for economic or national security reasons or told them to return later with even more documents. We see a picture of Breckinridge Long, who was the Assistant Secretary in the U.S. State Department from 1940 to 1944. Long supervised the State Department Visa Division, which slowed down immigration to the United States for thousands and thousands of refugees who were attempting to escape from Nazi persecution and murder. Acquiring a visa was almost impossible considering the State Department's policy. If you passed the official would stamp a visa in your passport, allowing you to fill one of the 27,370 quota slots. Thousands of people applied at American consulates in Europe. The odds were long for getting a visa because due to the complicated bureaucratic and expensive process. Even if the lengthy, difficult demands were fulfilled, applicants were still turned down. Otto wrote to his friends abroad and to refugee agencies. Otto reached out to Edith's brothers, Julius and Walter Hollander, both of whom had been arrested during Kristallnacht. Upon their release, one brother managed to immigrate to Switzerland and the other brother immigrated to Boston. Neither of the brother-in-laws had enough money to help the Frank family. The Frank family moved to Amsterdam in the fall of 1933, and by 1940, they were among the 140,000 Jews living in occupied Netherlands. The family was still on a waiting list, which was kept at the American consulate in Rotterdam. The Nazis then invaded the Netherlands on May 10, 1942, and bombing destroyed all of the papers. A paranoia existed about German spies entering the United States, which later led to increased discrimination against Jewish German immigrants. Even FDR warned that Jewish refugees could be spying under compulsion to save lives of family members held hostage in Nazi Germany. All of this contributed to making it more difficult for Germans to immigrate to America. The Evo Institute for Jewish Research recently released Otto's letters that were in documents discovered in their archives. And so we see some of the letters here. And on April 3, 1941, Otto wrote to his influential friend, Nathan Strauss Jr., who was then the head of the U.S. Housing Authority. Strauss was a friend of Eleanor Roosevelt and the son of Macy's co-owner. Otto wrote, "I'm forced to look out for immigration, and as far as I can see, the United States is the only country we could go to. It's for the sake of the children mainly that we have to care for. Our own fate is of less importance. You're the only person I can ask." Otto asked for $5,000 to cover a deposit related to getting a U.S. visa, but the money was ultimately not needed because a visa was not granted. Even Strauss's financial resources and political connections failed. The situation was complicated by the fact that the U.S. had closed all the German consulates and the Nazis closed all the American consulates in Germany and in Nazi-occupied territory. After that rejection, Otto tried to take his family to the United States via a more circuitous route through Cuba. Then they faced another roadblock. All German Jews living outside Germany were stripped of their nationality. Since the Frank family had never become Dutch citizens, they were officially stateless. Germans were considered the enemy. Cuba canceled Otto's immigration application a few days after the December 7, 1941 Pearl Harbor attack and the suspension of transatlantic shipping traffic. By 1941, we see Jews rounded up with the help of the Dutch police. And also, as Otto saw these ominous danger signs in the same year, he began his plans for turning the annex attached to his company into a secret hiding place. He appointed Johann Kleinman as the new director of Opeka. By 1942, Otto realized his efforts to get out of the Netherlands would not be successful. The call-up notice for Margot prompted the family to go into hiding immediately. And as you see here, the order required those assigned to only bring work clothes and boots. And we know the fate of the Frank family, of more than 30,000 Jews living in the Netherlands who were able to go into hiding or who made an escape abroad. Approximately 1/3 were betrayed or discovered, as was the case for the Frank family. The Netherlands had the greatest percentage of Jewish victims in Western Europe. Less than 25% of Dutch Jewry survived. Unlike in some other countries, Nazi police in the Netherlands were in almost complete control over the organization and execution of the deportations. The ruthless efficiency of the Nazis and their Dutch police and administrative collaborators doomed the Jews of the Netherlands. Years later, Miep was interviewed about her role in the annex with the Frank family, and she modestly answered, "I'm not a hero. I just did what any decent person would do." So as we close, one of Anne's entries particularly resonates with me. Anne wrote, "Where there is hope, there is life. It fills us with fresh courage and it makes us strong again." During these dark times, as we reflect on the anniversary of Anne Frank's birthday, let's recall what Otto said, and you may recognize this from the exhibit. "We cannot change what happened anymore. The only thing we can do is learn from the past and to realize what discrimination and persecution of innocent people means." So thank you for joining today with the Georgia Commission on the Holocaust in our inaugural virtual session. We welcome your feedback. Please send us your thoughts and suggestions. Continue to check our website for our newsletter and for future programs. So we look forward to seeing you soon. Be well. Thank you.